works up pretty good. Learned from screwing up a couple early ones. I was trying to do it on my phone. And there's on the Samsung, there's this microphone setting called Interview.
Mm-hmm.
It's horrible. It's like it tries to do it from both sides.
Oh, wow.
And then it just sounds... So I did one of them like that, and I was like, okay, I need to go get some a little more real. Do you ever do video stuff, or is that...
Yeah. It's been a while. Which I did something for World Food Program was the last thing I did. But so when I was at a newspaper in San Francisco, there was like a period where I was doing like almost exclusively video, and then I stopped, and then Final Cut changed to Final Cut X, and so I stopped needing to like learn the new things, and everything sort of changed.
Yeah.
So I had Final Cut X, but it like was kind of really different since they changed the sort of majorly the interface, right. And so I don't have editing. I'm not good at editing anymore. Like I know the principles, but I just don't know all the hotkeys and stuff. So I would like to so the last few things I've done have been like just shooting everything, miking everybody, doing all that, but then just handing off the raw assets to whoever the client is. So
cool.
Yeah.
All right, I'm good. I got good sound.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
I think this is picking up. So. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for being part of this. Okay. Cool. Yeah, thanks for being part of this.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you. And
nice to meet you too.
I appreciate you coming here all the way from Paris. I like telling people that you came just for this interview.
Yeah, fair enough.
You just happened to run into a wedding and some family along the way. But,
sure.
Yeah, really cool you could be here. I mean, when I talked to Anthony about possibly interviewing you, we kind of talked about it as a long shot because you were all the way across the pond. So it's cool to have you in person, and we haven't talked too much about the project, but basically what I'm doing is interviewing one CFSer from every age from 1 to 40.
Mm-hmm.
Basically just asking what's it like to be the age you are.
Okay.
And it's been great project so far. You're the 35th interview.
Mm-hmm.
So we're kind of in the home stretch.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited to learn about age 32 from you.
Sure.
So yeah, first off, just give me an intro of who you are and what you're up to at age 32.
Yeah, okay. So my name is Pete Keyhart. I am 32, as you mentioned. At the moment, I'm living in Paris, where I'm a freelance photographer for a bunch of different clients, mostly American. But I guess primarily the New York Times at the moment. That's my biggest client. But I've also done work recently for NPR, corporate work for Starbucks. I randomly work for some Danish newspapers. I don't know how that happened, but they seem to like me, and I like the way they use my photography. So that's where I am at right now, I guess.
Cool. How does age 32 feel for you?
That's a really good question. I don't know. That's a good question. I feel a little bit in between still, I think. I guess I don't know how much of this has to do with my age and how much my profession or sort of the life path I've chosen, but I have many friends who are having first children or second children who are married, and I'm kind of nowhere near that sort of life trajectory. So I wouldn't say nowhere near, but I'm definitely not married at the moment. I'm single. So I feel a little bit of a disconnect about that, and sometimes I feel a little bit of anxiety about that, about if I'm growing up correctly or if I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. But then when I am working, I feel very fulfilled and very intellectually stimulated. So in those moments, I know I'm doing the right thing. The problem is with freelancing, there's a lot of moments where I'm just sort of sitting around and not hoping for the phone to ring, because that's like a losing proposition, but sort of shouting into the void and hoping someone hires me or responds to my photography. And those moments can be kind of lonely, I guess.
Is this where you expected to be at 32?
Man, that's a good question. I guess I knew for a long time I wanted to do photography. I took my first photo class in middle school. I got my first camera when I was 6. It was a Polaroid. I was living in Boston at the time. Or I guess I must have been 4 or 5 because I moved here when I was 6. And then I took a photography class. It was supposed to be sort of a survey art class where one week we did charcoal and one week we did ceramics and one week we did darkroom. And I think like the minute they let me into the darkroom, I just sort of refused to come out and just kept doing photography in that space. And then I did 1 year for my end of year experience, which is I'm sure maybe people already know this, but something we do at the end of the year at Carolina Friends. It was sort of a 2-week program. Willie Rotella, who was still here at the time, suggested I do an internship with the local newspaper, and so I did that for 2 weeks, and then kind of kept kind of a similar thing that I did with the darkroom, just kind of never left that paper. It was the Durham Herald Sun, and I kept showing up and tagging along with photographers and taking assignments. So I guess I always thought I wanted to be a newspaper staff photographer, and that I got away from that for a couple of reasons. The main one being it's really hard to do this kind of work that I'm doing now, sort of overseas international work, including some conflict journalism, as a staff person at a newspaper, because newspaper budgets are shrinking and it's much easier for them to hire a freelancer like what I am now. So I guess in terms of like the family stuff I just referenced, like having kids or married, I didn't think that would be, that wasn't something I yearned for at a young age, but I sort of knew at a younger age I wanted to do photography. I wasn't sure exactly how that would manifest itself.
Cool. Yeah, it's funny thinking back on, on flipping the question on myself, like, where did I think I would be at 32? And as a kid, like, there's just this broad expectation of, like, oh, I'll be a grown-up. And
Yeah,
I'll have a
right.
job and spouse and kids and, family
Yeah.
and doing that. And then, but as you get more into these individual ages
Yeah.
of adulthood, it's just all kind of muddled, I guess.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so yeah, I could certainly relate to not having all those boxes checked
Right,
off and
right.
kind of just figuring out things as you go. But it sounds like professionally, you're spot on. Like, do you feel? And this is another question. I'll let you react to that.
Okay.
So,
Well, there's moments where it's great, and there's moments where it's really tough. And one of the things, I guess, this is getting a little granular, but for I guess 6 years after graduating college, I pretty much had a staff job in some way, form or another, or that I went 6 months without one, but I was sort of always seeking one. And that stability is something you get really used to, of
Right.
just the weekly paycheck or the bi-weekly paycheck or whatever. And so I'm a little worried I'm never going to be really comfortable with this idea. It was funny. I was telling some colleagues to come here, to come here just to do the interview. It's the only reason
of course,
I'm here.
yes.
I had to turn down 2 assignments because I knew I was going to be in the States, and people called, and I was saying, like, what if they never call again, and I'm still like, that's kind of still my mindset, and my colleagues were saying, that's great, people are calling, like, that's great news, that's, just enjoy that. And so that's something, it's tough. It's like, it feels very tenuous at all times. It's hard to just relax, and I don't know what it would take to be really comfortable in this career, and so I don't know how sustainable it is. But for now, it's good. For the next several years, I'm sort of committed to this, but it's a lot easier because I haven't checked all those boxes, like
Right.
kid, wife, any of those things. I don't have other mouths to feed other than my own, and my parents are in good health, thank God for that, and that sort of thing. So I'm very fortunate in that regard.
Yeah, stability has been a big theme that's popped up in this project.
Yeah.
And it was funny, there was one interview there that word was used as like, yeah, I feel stable, and it was like, oh my gosh, you're the first person in the whole project who said that. But you have put yourself in a position particularly where there's a lot of instability. And
Yeah.
It sounds like you feel that. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
As well as you've done, you're not void of that.
Right.
Insecurity that pops up in like an entrepreneurial role, freelance role.
Sure.
But okay, so what do you think is a core question that you find yourself asking at this age? Or should be asking?
Yeah, those are different questions. Let me think. I guess, in a way, for me, I think it's what am I supposed to be doing, and that question in and of itself takes a lot of forms. It can mean sort of, where should I be in order to have a successful photography business. I think there's kind of there's a lot of people who look at freelance journalism as strictly a business, and that's a really pragmatic and smart way to go about it. I still have a little trouble with that. Certainly I think to be successful financially, you have to have some of that, but I don't know, maybe I'm a romantic, so, but I find myself wondering, like, okay, I'm here in Paris, for instance, but Iraq is really interesting right now, or Burma is really interesting right now, or the United States is really interesting right now. That was sort of, that's been a weird thing in this time. Living abroad has been very bizarre to feel almost like that place that I think of as home, the United States, has changed in some way, or is very different now, and so almost feeling at times like I don't have a home, or something like that has been a little interesting.
So was that the question you find yourself asking, or you think you should be asking?
I think that's what I find myself asking. I guess the whole question of what questions I should be asking can arise from comparing myself with my former classmates, and again going back to those boxes that are being checked, or just sort of worrying about I have friends who've bought a house and that sort of thing, and I guess that's pretty normal, but I hate to keep bringing it back to sort of like financial or those sorts of things, but that's definitely part of it.
So part of this less traditional life you're living has probably given you a little bit more of an adventurous life.
Yeah, I think that's...
Can you think of, like, when you look back at age 32, what's a story you think that you'll be able to tell about this age or this phase of your life and what you're doing?
Like specifically 32, or just up until now? Because obviously the stories are in the past.
Yeah. Well,
so,
how long have you been 32?
I've been 32 for a little less than 6 months.
Okay.
So,
is there anything in the past 6 months from this age that you think, oh, this is a story or an adventure that kind of capture what was going on in your life?
Well, in the last 2 weeks, for instance, I've been to Germany and Milan, Italy, and I'd never been to Italy before. So that was just nice that the work was coming that frequently, and it was very diverse projects. So I did, in Germany, I did a story about NASCAR in Europe, which was crazy to me that NASCAR exists in Europe, and that was pretty much our angle, like what the hell is NASCAR doing in Europe? So that was interesting, and I'd never been to that part of Germany either. It was in Hockenheim, which is sort of near Stuttgart. But and then in Milan, I was working for Starbucks, and that was just my first time in Italy. I got to try some new food. I was in this very weird Starbucks sort of bubble because I was working for them as a corporate client, and so that was an interesting experience as well. But kind of I think when you drill down, one of my dreams, not my only dream, but one of my dreams was just to I'm going to rephrase this actually. One of my favorite things in the world is just getting a phone call that says, hey, can you go to this place you've never been before and take photos? Cool. And so just feeling that occurring in the last couple weeks has been really great.
That's awesome. And I could totally.
Is this the first time you've been feeling that that's happening consistently?
No, I wouldn't say it's the first time, but Paris has been. So I was in Ukraine for a year and a half, almost 2 years before. That was my first overseas posting, which I chose it, but I had kind of worked out like a stable routine there in terms of getting work and just sort of surviving, and then I picked up and moved to Paris, and that kind of have to like start all over, and in terms of just having editors knowing where you are and getting people to hire you to work in this new place. And there's also other challenges, like it's more expensive in Paris. There's a lot of other photographers in Paris. You know, it's sort of like this place everybody wants to go. So so it was a moment where it felt like it was really coming together more in Paris, I guess.
Gotcha. And I could totally relate to that feeling. 8 years ago, I took a job as a flight attendant, and a big part of, especially the early phases of that career, is you're on reserve. You're just on call.
Oh, really?
And I loved that feeling of getting the phone call.
Yeah.
And they would say, "Hey, we have an assignment for you. We're sending you to wherever."
Yeah.
And
it's the best.
It could be anywhere. And you know, you just. And they would never call it a trip. They call it an assignment.
Right.
So I feel like have kind of a 007
yeah.
feel to
There
it.
you go.
But yeah, I think as an adult, it becomes harder to create that spontaneity for yourself, and so to put yourself in a position where you can get that call and like be off in a moment's notice.
I think that's exactly right, and spontaneity is a really great word. I think one of the things that makes me uncomfortable, or one of the things I resist, is when I get to a point in my life where it's like, it seems like I pretty much know what's going to happen for the next whatever month or 6 months or week or 2 weeks, and I really like having that being a little bit more fluid. There's two sides to that coin, of course, but yeah, every time it's like I start to feel like, oh, okay, I'm just going into the office again, and I went in yesterday, I'm going in tomorrow, and this is what's happening. That kind of makes me tense up and makes me want to like seek out something new. So
it's interesting that that makes you tense.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of people.
Right.
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Right?
Yeah. I think it's like it's in your blood. And it could be for anybody, right?
Yeah.
You've gotten that taste of it.
Yeah.
And you know you can get through it comfortably.
Absolutely.
What would you say are the best parts of this age so far? The passions, the things that you're really excited about.
That's interesting. I'm having trouble thinking because I don't think of myself as like, I don't walk around thinking I'm 32, you know, like.
What do you think of yourself as?
I don't know. Let's see. I guess, I mean, I said a bunch of stuff about like sort of feeling insecure, feeling uncertain, but there does come, I think, a little bit of confidence with age, or you know, it's coming slowly, but a little bit more assuredness in my life and also my my photographic work. I think when I started out, I maybe got some bad advice in college. I don't know if this was, or I listened to the wrong people or something a little bit, but I tried to sort of do everything instead of really focusing on one thing, or a few things, and I just I think there's some people that approach their work, whatever it might be, music, so I guess to put it into musical terms would be, I think most musicians probably pick like one or two genres,
right.
And I think when I was starting out, I sort of tried to be like, you know, a classical musician, a rock and roll, a heavy metal, and I'm speaking in metaphor for photography, but I think I've settled in a little bit more to doing a few things and still exploring outside of my comfort zone from time to time, but doing that in a much more measured and doing that much more because it's something that interests me, not because I think, okay, maybe if I do this, then that magazine will hire me or whatever. Like doing, say, food photography just because I could make some money doing food photography, and instead really picking topics that interest me and really focusing on those topics.
Cool. What are those topics that get you excited?
Well, I've been doing more and more sports, as I talked about, and that's a little bit of a coincidence from an editor who really likes my work and who is sort of taking me under her wing. But I also I did a lot of work on refugees in 2015 and 2016. That's something I'm always keeping an eye out for a way to continue to work on that story. And conflict is something I've been interested in for a long time. I went to Ukraine to cover the war there, and I've been in, parts of the refugee crisis felt sort of like a conflict zone, and I was in Iraq in 2016, just before the Mosul offensive, and I kind of thought about going to the Mosul offensive, and I kind of regret not going to that, but those are the topics I've really been curious about. But then also, I'm working on something now, sort of, not even in my spare time. It's really like as I'm going from place to place in Paris, the people rip the billboards in the subway, and they become these like really beautiful mosaics of like different ads under one another, and then sometimes the ads are for like art exhibitions. So there's like a very famous painting incorporated into like an ad, and I just find that really sort of mesmerizing. And so I've been photographing that, or if I don't have my camera with me, I'll like note which metro station it was in, and I'll come back the next day. That's that sort of thing. But just sort of trusting that things that interest me will interest other people, I think, is something that helps me find new topics.
Cool. Actually shift this right here. I'm curious, from being in the thick of these conflicts, like these huge conflicts in different entire regions of the world.
Yeah.
Has that given you a different perspective on this idea of conflict, and even on a personal level of internal conflict or conflict on a one-on-one basis?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be crazy to say, for anybody to say, oh, I went into conflict and like nothing changed.
Yeah.
So for sure the answer is yes. In terms of, I guess, like, so one of the first things I learned was, I think we have this idea of war being like very binary, that like the place is at war and just like everyone is fighting the war, and like everything is conflict or gunfire or something like that, and that's just not the case. I was in a city that was shelled in Ukraine. It happened a couple times, but there was one where I was sitting in my hotel, and I actually didn't even realize, like, there was these explosions, but the military often trained nearby, so that wasn't that unusual. And then people started running in the house, or in the hotel rather, and I later went outside, and someone had died a few blocks away, and that was moving to see. But it's weird because it's like, it's almost like getting struck by lightning. Like those people were so unlucky because these rockets are launched from so far away, and they come down, and and I was fortunate, of course, but you realize it underscores the randomness of war, and sort of how that's like its own sense of brutality in a way. So I think that was one of the first sort of lessons I learned from going into conflict.
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah, go.
Imagine you've come back to be a teacher here. You know what kind of education you're getting in middle school, upper school. What would you want them to learn from your experience? Is this Quaker education school, peaceful school, and you're going to these conflict regions? What is it you like? Man, someone should have told me this when I was their age.
Whew, great question. I guess. By the way, for this question, should I look at you?
Okay,
or
Okay. Pretend like I asked.
Cool. Yeah.
Give me the
I'll
credit.
give you the credit.
I just felt like that was rude, but I thought
No,
that was like from the filmmaker mind.
Yeah.
I think the main thing is, or the most important thing, is just to expose students to these issues and to the idea that conflict is real, and that it's happening all over the world. I think that's the most important thing. And it's an interesting question for me because I strive to be objective and to sort of, to a point, just present what I see and allow people to draw their own conclusions. So I have a little bit of trouble sometimes, like trying to engender a specific response with my experience or with my photographs, because to a degree that's like the definition of propaganda, but at the same time, like I still really relate to CFS's message of pacifism and the Quaker notion of peace, but I think that you can't use that to be afraid of these places. Like I don't carry a weapon when I go to these places. That's journalistic code of ethics, and I think that keeps me more safe, frankly, because I mean, I've been asked a couple times to hold a weapon, even just for a moment, while a soldier did something, and I've just refused, because if someone sees me carrying a weapon, they could rightly assume that I'm a combatant and I'm kind of fair game. So there's important ethical and you have to have kind of a code when you go to these places, but I do think it's important to see these places and to learn from them. So I think my experience has been that we also sort of equate, you hear there's a war in Ukraine, and then you think, well, Kiev must be really dangerous, and that's just not the case. The other sort of corollary to that is not only is war not binary, but it's often confined to a very small part of a larger region. So we think Iraq is really dangerous, but in fact Kurdistan is quite nice. We think Ukraine is dangerous, but in fact Ukraine is the largest country in Europe, but the area that is affected by the conflict is sort of the size of New Jersey. So it's quite far over there, and Kiev is rather nice, and Lviv is rather nice, and Odessa I've never been, but I've heard great things. So I guess that's the other thing, is to recognize the nuance of these conflicts and to also not discount entire countries or entire people or entire regions just because you heard that someone shot a gun somewhere near that place.
So you're pretty relaxed in these situations. You're not, I mean, on a broad level, you are in a danger zone. But
Yeah.
But it sounds like your personal experience, you're pretty relaxed through this, or feeling comfortable in these situations.
I think to a point and within reason. I think panicking is like the most dangerous thing you can do, and oftentimes in freelance journalism, you sort of buddy up with other people. Ideally, I think it's like people who don't also do photography, because then you're kind of stepping on each other's toes. So like ideally, have like a writer, a videographer, a photographer, or something like that, radio person, whatever. But sometimes you work as a team of photographers, and it's always important to find other people who are sort of a similar disposition and just sort of vet them a little bit, because someone freaks out, you could get into trouble. But at the same time, I have sort of a rule. One of the reasons you buddy up is to share costs, right? And so a lot of times you have to pay a driver for a day, and if there's three of you splitting the cost of the driver, it's the same cost for him, but it's less for everybody else. But I have kind of a rule when I work in a dangerous situation for my car, that is, if somebody says, I don't feel right about this, something's wrong, I think we should get out, you can push back on that a little bit, but you have to kind of respect that, because if you have somebody who's beginning to freak out in your group, that can be bad news and dangerous. But also I think that sometimes, I mean, it sounds a little superstitious, but a lot of times maybe you don't know what you saw, but you saw something that was wrong, or that was indicative of impending danger, and that's important to respect. So that's something that I kind of like try and adhere to. But we also you don't like just blindly drive into something that you don't know what it's like, right? I mean, research is super important. And that goes from everything from reading articles that have been written to then calling that journalist who wrote the article and say, hey, what's new since you wrote that article? What can you tell me? I'm thinking about going to this place. how do you think I should do that? Is a car safe? Is this road safe? Those sorts